In the autumn of 1823, the small town of Milbrook, Pennsylvania was shaken by 17 inexplicable fatalities over just 3 months. The sheer number was unsettling, but what truly horrified the community was that every single victim had been handled for burial by the same local family-run business. The Hartwell Funeral Parlor had served the area for more than 2 decades, building a solid reputation for their meticulous care of the deceased and compassionate support for bereaved families. However, a visiting physician's routine health inspection led him to notice unusual markings on several bodies, uncovering evidence that would devastate this peaceful Pennsylvania town. What the authorities ultimately found in the Hartwell establishment's basement was so terrible that local officials deliberately concealed the records for nearly a century. Some speculate that the complete story has never fully come to light. Before we delve deeper into the narrative of the Hartwell family and their house of horrors, if dark historical mysteries like this captivate you, be sure to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell. We deliver the most spine-chilling true accounts from America's past. Also, share the state or city you're tuning in from in the comments. We value connecting with our global community of mystery enthusiasts, but let me transport you back to the Pennsylvania countryside of 1823, where the Hartwell family had established what seemed to be a respected enterprise built upon a foundation of unspeakable darkness. Milbrook was situated among the rolling hills of southeastern Pennsylvania, a modest settlement of barely 300 residents who earned their living through farming, logging, and occasionally catering to travelers stopping at the town's lone inn. The year 1823 was a time of expansion for the nascent American Republic. Yet small towns like Milbrook remained largely cut off from the vibrant cities of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Here everyone was privy to their neighbors' affairs. Children roamed freely, and mutual trust was the glue that held the community together. The Hartwell family settled in Milbrook in 1801, when the patriarch Ezekiel Hartwell acquired a substantial stone house on the edge of town and opened the area's first dedicated funeral parlor. Prior to the Hartwells' arrival, families typically prepared their dead themselves or relied on the local carpenter to construct caskets. Initially, some townspeople regarded Ezekiel's professional approach to death care with skepticism, but his respectful demeanor and reasonable pricing quickly earned the community's favor. Ezekiel resided in the funeral home with his wife Martha, their 3 children, sons Josiah and Caleb, and daughter Rebecca and Martha's aged father, Thomas Creed. The family appeared to embody the strong Protestant work ethic characteristic of rural Pennsylvania. They attended services at the Methodist Church every Sunday, participated in community barn raisings, and Martha was renowned for delivering baked goods to families in distress. Josiah, the 26-year-old eldest son, had been taught the embalming profession by his father and was set to inherit the business. Caleb, 23, assisted with woodworking and interments. Rebecca, just 19, helped her mother with household tasks and frequently comforted grieving families with her gentle disposition. The Hartwell property consisted of a 3-story stone structure with a timber annex that housed the preparation areas. The main level served as both the family's living space and the viewing area for deceased loved ones. A narrow stairway led to the 2nd floor where the family's private chambers were located, while another set of steps descended to a basement that had been converted into the embalming and storage facility. The premises also included a large shed where coffins were assembled and a small burial plot for those unable to afford interment elsewhere. The Hartwells gained particular trust in the community due to their commitment to serving families irrespective of their financial means. During harsh winters when harvests failed, they frequently accepted payment for services in the form of food or future labor. This generosity established a network of grateful patrons throughout the region, and word of their compassionate service reached surrounding communities. By 1823, the Hartwell Funeral Parlor was managing almost every death within a 15-mile radius. The political environment in 1823 Pennsylvania was marked by friction between established rural values and the increasing influence of industrialization. The Erie Canal was nearing completion in New York, promising significant economic growth for the region, but also threatening the traditional structure of small-town life. Religious revivals swept across Pennsylvania, bringing both spiritual revitalization and social turbulence as traditional sources of authority were challenged. Within this climate of change and uncertainty, institutions like the Hartwell Funeral Parlor symbolized stability and continuity. Nevertheless, concealed beneath this veneer of respectability, something horrifying was taking root within the Hartwell residents. The seclusion of their work, the deep trust placed in them by heartbroken families, and the very nature of their occupation created possibilities that most people could never conceive. Death had become not merely their means of income but an outright obsession. The boundary between providing care for the dead and actively contributing to death was about to be crossed in ways that would shock anyone who uncovered the truth. The initial indication that something was seriously wrong occurred on October 15, 1823, with the arrival of Dr. Samuel Harrison in Milbrook for his annual health survey of the neighboring townships. Dr. Harrison was a circuit physician employed by the state to track disease outbreaks and ensure proper sanitation was maintained in rural areas. His visits were typically routine, involving checks of water sources, food storage methods, and burial procedures. What first caught Dr. Harrison's attention was not the recent spike in deaths in Milbrook, but the unusual circumstances he encountered during his mandatory inspection of the Hartwell funeral parlor. Pennsylvania state law mandated that all deceased persons be accessible for medical examination, if requested by a state physician, a rule enacted following multiple cholera epidemics in the preceding decade. When Dr. Harrison arrived at the Hartwell establishment on that crisp autumn morning, Ezekiel Hartwell and his son Josiah offered him a cordial reception. The two men gave him a tour of their facilities, proudly showcasing their modern embalming equipment and immaculate preparation areas. Everything appeared to be in order until Dr. Harrison asked to examine 3 individuals currently in their care, awaiting funeral services later that week. The first body was that of Eleanor Fairchild, a 68-year-old widow who had purportedly succumbed to consumption 3 days prior. As Dr. Harrison conducted his examination, he noticed something chilling. Barely visible below the high collar of her burial gown, along Elena's neck, were faint but unmistakable bruise marks. The pattern was consistent with manual strangulation, not the wasting disease that was said to have ended her life. When Dr. Harrison inquired about the marks, Josiah Hartwell quickly claimed that they had awkwardly positioned Eleanor during the embalming, resulting in post-mortem bruising. The explanation sounded plausible enough, but something in Josiah's demeanor, a slight quiver in his voice, the way he avoided direct eye contact, prompted Dr. Harrison to examine the remaining 2 bodies with greater scrutiny. The second deceased person was Marcus Webb, a seemingly healthy 42-year-old farmer who had allegedly suffered a heart attack while working in his fields. Dr. Harrison's examination revealed an even more unsettling detail. Small puncture wounds on Webb's arms and chest, precisely located and too deliberate to be accidental. When pressed for an explanation, Ezekiel Hartwell asserted that Webb must have fallen onto farming implements during his collapse, yet the wounds were too clean and purposeful for a random accident. The third body provided the most definitive proof. Mary Patterson, a 26-year-old mother of 2, had supposedly died of a fever after a brief sickness. However, Dr. Harrison detected residue of a white powder around her mouth and beneath her fingernails. His medical training immediately identified the substance as arsenic, a poison unfortunately common in rural regions where it was used to manage rodent populations. As Dr. Harrison documented his discoveries, he became acutely aware of a tense atmosphere within the Hartwell home. The family members exchanged knowing glances, their previous warmth replaced by a cold vigilance. Martha Hartwell, who had been preparing tea, appeared in the doorway with an expression that could only be described as menacing. Even young Rebecca, who had seemed so harmless, watched the events unfold with eyes that suggested a hidden understanding far beyond her years. The basement preparation room, which Dr. Harrison insisted on inspecting more thoroughly, revealed further disturbing details. Along one wall, there were several large glass jars containing various chemical solutions, some holding what appeared to be human organs preserved for undisclosed reasons. When asked about these specimens, Ezekiel claimed they were for educational purposes, to gain a better understanding of the diseases that afflicted their clients. But the organs looked fresh, and some had been divided with a surgical precision that seemed excessive for mere preservation. Most disconcerting of all was a leather-bound journal that Dr. Harrison spotted, partially obscured beneath a pile of burial attire. But in the brief moment Dr. Harrison saw it, he noticed what appeared to be precise observations regarding various people in the community, including detailed notes on their health, family situations, and financial standing. As the inspection concluded, Dr. Harrison faced a challenging situation. His professional medical judgment indicated that at least 3 of the recent fatalities showed clear evidence of deliberate harm, but his current proof was entirely circumstantial, and the Hartwell family held a position of high respect within the community. Furthermore, as an external inspector conducting a standard review, any accusations he made would be met with profound disbelief by local officials who had relied on and trusted the Hartwells for more than 2 decades. That evening, as Dr. Harrison drafted his initial findings at the Milbrook Inn, several townspeople approached him, having heard about his visit to the funeral parlor. Their whispered conversations revealed a chilling pattern. In hushed tones, they spoke of the abnormally high rate of recent deaths, the way seemingly healthy individuals would suddenly become fatally ill within just a few days, and the almost too eager attention the Hartwell family gave to news of someone's deteriorating health. A particularly unsettling story came from Sarah Peaton, whose aging mother had passed away only 2 weeks prior. Sarah confessed that her mother had been in good health and spirits until Martha Hartwell began visiting frequently, bringing home-cooked soup and offering solace during a mild episode of joint discomfort. Within 3 days of these visits, the elderly woman had fallen critically ill and died before a physician could be called. The Hartwell family had immediately stepped in, offering their services and waiving their standard fee out of apparent sympathy. Dr. Harrison's alarming discoveries in Milbrook were not the first time the Hartwell family's practices had raised alarm bells, although prior concerns had been dismissed or forgotten by a trusting public. As he investigated the family's background more deeply, a pattern of questionable deaths began to emerge, stretching back to their very arrival in Pennsylvania over 2 decades earlier. The Hartwells had relocated to Milbrook from Western Virginia in 1801, claiming that Ezekiel had learned the burial trade from an uncle in Richmond. They purchased their current property from the estate of a recently deceased landowner, paying with gold coins that seemed suspiciously plentiful for a family claiming modest financial means. Records from that period indicate that their first winter in Milbrook was marked by an outbreak of what was termed a wasting sickness that claimed 8 lives, every one of whom was prepared for burial by the newly opened Hartwell funeral parlor. Over the years, townspeople had occasionally noted certain oddities surrounding fatalities managed by the Hartwells. Families would later mention how quickly their loved ones seemed to fade once the Hartwells offered their help, how aggressively the family sought to manage all arrangements, and how they actively discouraged getting second medical opinions or delaying the interment. However, in a tight-knit community where the Hartwells had consistently shown themselves to be charitable and compassionate, such observations were written off as the natural suspicion that often accompanies profound sorrow. The basement of the Hartwell establishment concealed secrets that would have horrified the community if they had come to light. Behind a false wall that Dr. Harrison failed to detect during his tour, the family maintained what amounted to a laboratory dedicated to murder. Shelves were filled with various poisons. There were surgical instruments far more advanced than anything required for funeral preparation, and detailed anatomical diagrams that hinted at experimentation extending well beyond the simple care of the dead. Most damning of all was the complete version of the journal Dr. Harrison had fleetingly seen. This leather-bound volume contained meticulous records of every person who had died in their care, along with extensive notes on the effectiveness of different methods and toxic substances. The entries, penned in multiple hands over many years, revealed a systematic approach to murder that had been perfected through careful practice and observation. The journal documented not only the lethal techniques used, but also the careful selection of victims. The Hartwells had developed a sophisticated insight into their community, targeting individuals whose deaths would be grieved, but not heavily scrutinized. Elderly people with few living relatives, those with pre-existing health conditions, and people experiencing financial hardship were the preferred targets. The family had also learned to time their activities carefully, ensuring that no obvious pattern would draw unwanted attention. One particularly chilling entry, written in Josiah's neat hand, described the murder of Marcus Webb with cold, clinical precision. Webb had been chosen because he was a widower without close family, and his farm bordered the Hartwell property, making the disposal of evidence convenient. The entry detailed how Webb had been lured to the funeral home under the pretense of discussing the purchase of a coffin for a recently deceased neighbor. Once there, he was overpowered and subjected to what the journal euphemistically termed experimental procedures before being killed, and his body arranged to suggest a heart attack. The family's motivation appeared to be a complex mix of financial reward, psychological gratification, and what could only be described as a strange scientific curiosity about the moment of death. They routinely stole money and valuables from their victims, yet this seemed secondary to their intense focus on causing and observing death. Several journal entries detailed their trials with different poisons, their observations of how various individuals reacted to fear and pain, and their efforts to perfect methods that would leave no discernible evidence of foul play. Martha Hartwell emerged from the journal entries as perhaps the most dangerous member of the family. Her specialty involved befriending isolated or vulnerable community members, slowly gaining their confidence before introducing poisons into food or drink she prepared for them. Her respectable appearance and reputation for compassion made her the ideal predator, capable of approaching potential victims without arousing the slightest suspicion. The children had been gradually brought into the family's gruesome activities as they grew older. Rebecca, despite her youth and innocent demeanor, had become adept at identifying potential victims during social gatherings, reporting back to her family about individuals who seemed lonely, frail, or financially stressed. Both sons had developed expertise in the physical aspects of murder, learning to subdue victims and meticulously stage crime scenes to avoid detection. What made the Hartwell operation so deeply sinister was its complete integration into the community's social structure. They attended church, participated in town meetings, and maintained close relationships with many of the very people they were systematically murdering. This double life required a degree of psychological separation that suggested either innate psychopathy or a gradual descent into madness that had consumed the entire family. The autumn of 1823 marked a clear escalation in their activities, fueled by both opportunity and burgeoning confidence. The preceding winter had been severe, leaving many families in financial distress and vulnerable to the Hartwells' offers of assistance. Simultaneously, the family's success in evading capture had made them increasingly daring, leading to the accelerated pace of deaths that ultimately attracted Dr. Harrison's attention. Dr. Harrison faced a moral and professional challenge that would test both his integrity and personal courage. His medical findings clearly indicated murder, yet reporting his discoveries to local authorities would mean leveling an accusation of systematic murder against a well-respected family, a charge that would seem unbelievable to a community that had trusted the Hartwells for more than 2 decades. Moreover, Dr. Harrison was scheduled to continue his inspection tour to nearby townships within days, and delaying his departure would necessitate explanations he was not prepared to provide. The solution arrived from an unexpected quarter. On his second night in Milbrook, Dr. Harrison was approached by Thomas Creed, Martha Hartwell's elderly father, who requested a private medical appointment. The old man claimed to be suffering from intense stomach discomfort and asked Dr. Harrison to examine him away from the funeral home. They met in the stable behind the inn, where Creed's entire manner instantly shifted from that of a frail patient to something far more calculated. "Doctor," Creed whispered, his eyes anxiously scanning the street, "I know what you found during your examination today. The marks, the poison, the wounds that don't match the claimed causes of death. You're right to be suspicious, but you don't understand the full scope of what's happening in that house." "What?" Thomas Creed disclosed to Dr. Harrison over the next hour, painted a portrait of evil that surpassed even the physician's growing suspicions. Creed revealed that his own family had been systematically administering poison to him over the last few months, causing him to experience the identical symptoms that preceded the deaths of numerous recent victims. His advanced age and poor health made him a perfect subject for the family's gruesome experiments, yet his instinct for survival and familiarity with their methods enabled him to recognize and thwart their attempts on his life. According to Creed, the family's criminal enterprise began simply with grave robbery. Shortly after their arrival in Milbrook, Ezekiel discovered that recently interred bodies could be unearthed and stripped of valuable items like jewelry, gold dental work, and clothing, which could then be resold in distant communities. This initial illicit activity progressively morphed into something far more terrible, as the family realized they could significantly boost their profits by generating their own supply of bodies. The pivotal change occurred in 1807, when the family inadvertently caused the death of a gravely ill man they were intending to rob. Instead of risking exposure, they successfully concealed the crime and observed that the community readily accepted the victim's death as a natural progression of his sickness. This easy success prompted increasingly brazen experiments with murder, leading each family member to develop specialized skills and roles in their expanding operation. Creed disclosed that the basement laboratory contained detailed records of over 40 murders committed during the past 16 years, with victims meticulously chosen from across the region to avoid detection. The family had established a network of associates in nearby towns who would tip them off to potential targets. Isolated individuals, travelers, or anyone whose disappearance might not be immediately investigated. What made Creed's testimony especially convincing was his intimate knowledge of the family's procedures and his ability to provide precise details about the recent victims Dr. Harrison had examined. He described exactly how Eleanor Fairchild had been strangled, how Marcus Webb had been tormented before his death, and how Mary Patterson had been slowly poisoned over several weeks, while Martha feigned nursing her through a fabricated illness. The elderly man also disclosed the existence of a mass grave hidden in the woods behind the Hartwell property, where the family dumped victims whose deaths could not plausibly be disguised as natural. This clandestine burial site held the remains of at least a dozen people, including several travelers who had stopped at the funeral home for directions or refuge and were never seen again. Creed's motivation for exposing his family was both personal survival and moral outrage. He had grown increasingly sickened by their actions, but more critically, he realized his own death was imminent. The family had tired of supporting him, and recent discussions made it clear his value as a test subject was coming to an end. His only chance for survival was to reveal their crimes and seek protection from the authorities. The old man proposed a strategy that would enable Dr. Harrison to collect irrefutable evidence while ensuring the immediate safety of both of them from retaliation. Creed would give the physician the key to the hidden basement laboratory, allowing him to inspect the concealed records and evidence during the family's absence at Sunday church services. This window would provide Dr. Harrison with the documentation necessary to persuade the authorities, while Creed would use the same opportunity to escape to a distant relative's residence in Philadelphia. Dr. Harrison spent the rest of the night grappling with the overwhelming implications of Creed's shocking disclosures. The magnitude of the crimes was stunning, involving dozens of murders committed over nearly 2 decades by a family that was trusted and respected by their entire community. The evidence Creed promised would likely be enough to secure convictions, yet it would also shatter the sense of faith and security for hundreds of innocent people who believed themselves safe in their small town. Even more worrying was the realization that Dr. Harrison himself was now in danger. His examination of the bodies had clearly raised the family's suspicions, and his continued presence in Milbrook represented a critical threat to their entire operation. Creed warned that the family had previously killed to safeguard their secrets, and they would not hesitate to do so again if they felt trapped. The plan they formulated required flawless timing and significant courage. Dr. Harrison needed to access the hidden basement laboratory, meticulously document the evidence found there, and escape Milbrook before the family became aware of what had transpired. Simultaneously, Creed would vanish during the same time frame, making his disappearance appear to be a tragic wandering off due to senile confusion, an event that would be sorrowful but not immediately suspicious. Sunday morning broke gray and cold, with a November chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of Milbrook's residents as they prepared for their weekly worship services. Dr. Harrison had passed a sleepless night at the inn, oscillating between reviewing his medical notes and doubting the sanity of the dangerous plan he had committed to undertaking. The pressure of the potentially damning evidence hidden in the Hartwell basement weighed on his mind like a physical load, made heavier by the knowledge that his own life was now at risk. Thomas Creed had provided him with highly specific instructions for entering the basement laboratory during the family's absence at church. The Hartwells, being prominent members of the Methodist congregation, never missed Sunday services and typically stayed for social gatherings that lasted well into the afternoon. This would grant Dr. Harrison approximately 3 hours to locate and document the crucial evidence Creed had described. The key Creed had given him was small and intricate, designed to unlock a hidden compartment behind the basement's stone wall. According to the old man, this compartment contained not only the complete murder journal but also preserved specimens, poison stores, and detailed anatomical drawings that would offer irrefutable proof of the family's crimes. Crucially, it also held a detailed map showing the precise location of the hidden burial ground, where dozens of victims had been secretly disposed of over the years. As the church bells tolled across Milbrook, Dr. Harrison positioned himself in the woods behind the Hartwell property, observing the family leave their home dressed in their Sunday best. Ezekiel wore a black suit that lent him a dignified, ministerial air, while Martha had chosen a dark blue dress with a white collar that highlighted her maternal respectability. Josiah and Caleb walked beside their parents, appearing every bit the dutiful sons, while Rebecca walked demurely next to her mother, her innocent appearance masking the calculating mind Creed had described. What Dr. Harrison found most unnerving was how utterly normal the family looked as they walked toward the church. Their faces betrayed no hint of the evil Creed had described, no suggestion that they had systematically murdered dozens of innocent people over the past 2 decades. They exchanged friendly greetings with neighbors, smiled at children playing in the yards, and presented themselves as the absolute model of Christian virtue and family values. The physician waited a full 30 minutes after the family's departure before approaching the funeral home. The building stood silent and imposing in the weak autumn sunlight, its stone walls concealing secrets that would shock the entire community if revealed. Dr. Harrison's hand shook slightly as he used Thomas Creed's key to enter through the basement door. But his medical training had prepared him for confronting unsettling realities, and he forced himself to proceed systematically. Initially, the basement appeared exactly as it had during his official inspection, clean, organized, and maintained professionally. The embalming tables were immaculate, the chemical solutions correctly labeled and stored, and the few bodies currently in their care lay peacefully beneath white sheets. It was only when Dr. Harrison began a careful examination of the walls that he located the concealed entrance Creed had described. Behind a section of stone wall that looked identical to the rest of the basement, the small key unlocked a hidden panel that revealed a chamber of horrors, exceeding his worst nightmares. The secret room was significantly larger than the main basement, extending beneath the entire foundation of the house and into the adjoining hillside. Shelves lined the walls, holding hundreds of glass jars filled with preserved human organs, each carefully labeled with dates and what appeared to be scientific notation. The murder journal held a place of honor on a wooden lectern in the center of the room. The leather-bound volume was thick with years of entries written in multiple hands, but with a consistent attention to detail that suggested a scientific method applied to the act of murder. Dr. Harrison's medical training allowed him to understand the technical details of what he was reading, but the clinical detachment with which the family had documented their crimes was perhaps more terrifying than the murders themselves. Every entry followed a similar structure: identification of the victim, method of approach, lethal technique employed, observations about the victim's responses, and notes for future reference. The entries documented a clear escalation from simple poisonings to increasingly sophisticated methods, suggesting years of practice and refinement. Recent entries documented experiments involving various surgical techniques. What truly horrified Dr. Harrison was the finding that the family's criminal activities extended well beyond Milbrook. The journal meticulously documented murders in at least 6 separate Pennsylvania townships, with victims selected during the family's travels, when they were providing funeral services for more distant clients. They had developed a specific strategy for identifying vulnerable individuals in each community, frequently returning months later to commit crimes in regions where they would be least suspected. The anatomical drawings proved to be even more disturbing than the journal entries. Highly detailed illustrations showed the advancement of various experimental procedures with precise notes on which techniques induced the greatest amount of fear in the victims and which methods were most successful for different types of people. The drawings clearly suggested that the family viewed their victims not as human beings, but as mere subjects for scientific inquiry, approaching murder with the same systematic precision that ethical researchers might apply to animal specimens. As Dr. Harrison continued his thorough examination of the hidden chamber, he suddenly became aware of voices outside the building. Glancing at his pocket watch, he realized with mounting dread that he had been in the basement for over 2 hours, completely absorbed in documenting the damning evidence he had uncovered. The voices intensified, and he distinctly recognized the unique tone of Ezekiel Hartwell's speech as the family returned from church far earlier than anticipated. Panic seized Dr. Harrison as he grasped the gravity of his situation. He was trapped inside the secret chamber with conclusive evidence of the family's atrocities, and they would undoubtedly kill him if they discovered his presence. The voices moved closer to the structure, and he could hear the distinct sound of footsteps on the wooden porch directly above him. His planned escape route through the main basement door would lead him directly into their path, but remaining hidden in the chamber would only postpone his discovery until they inevitably came to check on their secrets. Just when it seemed Dr. Harrison's investigation might finally expose the awful truth about the Hartwell family, the situation turned suddenly and deadly. If this narrative is sending chills down your spine, please share this video with a friend who appreciates dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our channel's content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's find out together what happens next in this house of horrors. In a desperate search for an alternative way out, Dr. Harrison noticed that the secret chamber continued further than he had initially realized. At the far end of the room, partially obscured behind stacks of glass specimen jars, was another door that appeared to lead deeper into the adjacent hillside. With the family's voices growing ever closer, he had no alternative but to risk exploring this unknown passage, praying it would lead to freedom rather than plunge him deeper into the nightmare he had uncovered. The narrow passage behind the specimen room led Dr. Harrison through a rough-hewn tunnel that extended deep into the earth behind the Hartwell property. The walls were uneven stone, carved with primitive tools but showing signs of years of gradual expansion. As he navigated the tunnel by the light of a candle he had found in the chamber, the physician began to understand the full, terrifying scope of the Hartwell family's criminal enterprise. The tunnel eventually opened into a natural cave that had been converted into what could only be described as a charnel house. Human remains were scattered throughout the vast cavern, some neatly arranged on stone shelves, while others were simply piled in corners where they had been hastily discarded. The smell of death and decay was overpowering. Despite his mounting horror, Dr. Harrison's medical training allowed him to examine the scene with professional detachment. What he discovered in that underground cemetery revealed the full extent of the family's crimes. The remains of at least 40 individuals were present in various states of decomposition, representing decades of systematic murder. Some of the bodies showed evidence of the experimental procedures meticulously documented in the journal, while others appeared to have been killed quickly and efficiently. Personal belongings scattered among the remains, jewelry, clothing fragments, coins, indicated that robbery had indeed been a significant motive for many of the murders. Most disturbing of all was a section of the cave, where recent victims had been, displayed almost like trophies. Dr. Harrison recognized clothing and jewelry belonging to several individuals he had examined during his official inspection, confirming that the Hartwells had been systematically murdering their clients, rather than merely preparing natural deaths for burial. The chilling, clinical arrangement of these bodies suggested that the family visited this underground chamber regularly, perhaps to reenact their crimes, or to continue their horrific experiments. As Dr. Harrison documented his findings in the cave, he heard voices echoing through the tunnel behind him. The Hartwells had realized his absence from the inn, and had clearly found evidence of his intrusion into their secret chamber. Multiple voices called out his name, but their tone was not one of concern. It was the patient, predatory sound of hunters pursuing cornered prey. The cave system proved to have multiple exits, and Dr. Harrison successfully escaped through a narrow opening that led to the wooded hillside above the Hartwell property. From this elevated vantage point, he could see the family meticulously searching the area around their home, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had conducted such searches many times before. It became chillingly clear that Dr. Harrison was not the first person to uncover their secrets, and the methodical way they combed the area suggested that previous investigators had not survived their discoveries. The physician's subsequent escape from Milbrook demanded all his knowledge of wilderness survival, and a considerable amount of luck. He was forced to abandon his belongings at the inn and travel cross-country toward the nearest substantial town, avoiding all roads where the Hartwells might pursue him. His medical bag contained sufficient documentation to convince state authorities, but he desperately needed to reach a civilized area before the family could silence him permanently. What Dr. Harrison tragically did not know was that Thomas Creed had not escaped as planned. The elderly man had been discovered attempting to leave the house and was immediately confronted by his family about his betrayal. Under torture, Creed had confessed everything about his arrangement with Dr. Harrison, including the physician's plans to document their crimes and expose them to the authorities. This devastating revelation prompted the family to return early from church and initiate their search for Dr. Harrison. More ominously, it convinced them that their long-running operation in Milbrook was no longer sustainable. Rather than simply eliminating Dr. Harrison and continuing their activities, they made the decision to abandon their established base and relocate to a new community, where they could start afresh. The Hartwells' departure from Milbrook was executed with the same careful planning as their decades of murders. They publicly claimed that Ezekiel had received an urgent message about a dying relative in Ohio, necessitating an immediate journey that might keep them away for several months. They announced that the funeral home would be temporarily closed, and they asked trusting neighbors to keep watch over their property during their absence. To the majority of the community, this appeared to be a reasonable family emergency requiring their sympathy and support. What the townspeople failed to realize was that the Hartwells were systematically destroying evidence of their crimes before leaving. The secret chamber was emptied and sealed. The cave system was partially collapsed to conceal the remains it contained, and all documentary evidence of their activities was either destroyed or packed for transport to their new, unknown location. By the time Dr. Harrison finally reached authorities in Philadelphia 3 days later, the Hartwell family had completely vanished, leaving behind only an empty funeral home and a community that would never suspect the horrors that had been committed in their midst. Dr. Harrison's detailed account of what he had uncovered was met with profound skepticism by Philadelphia authorities, who found it difficult to believe that a respectable family could have committed such extensive, undetected crimes. The physician's evidence was compelling, but most of it had been destroyed or effectively hidden by the time investigators finally reached Milbrook. The few human remains they managed to recover from the partially collapsed cave system were deemed insufficient to fully support the vast scope of Dr. Harrison's horrific accusations. The subsequent investigation was significantly hampered by the community's refusal to believe such terrible things about the Hartwell family. Townspeople provided glowing character references for the Hartwells, insisting that they had been generous, caring neighbors who simply could never have committed the crimes Dr. Harrison described. Without the family present to interrogate and with most physical evidence effectively destroyed, authorities were ultimately forced to conclude that while suspicious circumstances certainly existed, there was insufficient proof to warrant a massive statewide manhunt. Creed's disappearance was officially explained by the family as the tragic wandering of a confused, senile old man who had gotten lost in the woods. Search parties found no trace of him, and his final fate remained officially unknown, though Dr. Harrison harbored no doubt that Creed had paid the ultimate price for his courageous attempt to expose his family's crimes. The aftermath of Dr. Harrison's discoveries continued to haunt both him and the community of Milbrook for years to come. The physician submitted detailed reports to state authorities, but without the Hartwell family present for questioning, and with most physical evidence destroyed, the case was eventually classified as inconclusive and filed away within the burgeoning bureaucracy of the Pennsylvania state government. Dr. Harrison remained steadfast in his belief concerning what he had witnessed, dedicating significant personal funds to the attempt to locate the Hartwell family. His ongoing investigations uncovered a pattern of similar disappearances and suspicious fatalities in various Ohio communities throughout 1824 and 1825, but by the time he managed to alert authorities in those areas, the family had once again vanished without a trace. Over the subsequent decade, Dr. Harrison meticulously documented similar patterns of crime in Indiana, Illinois, and eventually the Missouri Territory, consistently arriving too late to prevent further murders or apprehend the perpetrators. The people of Milbrook were forced to confront the terrible possibility that they had lived alongside systematic murderers for over 2 decades. Some citizens adamantly refused to accept Dr. Harrison's account, insisting the Hartwells were good neighbors who were being falsely maligned. Others began scrutinizing past deaths with new suspicion, questioning how many of their loved ones had actually been murdered rather than claimed by natural causes. The Hartwell funeral parlor building stood deserted for nearly 2 years before a Philadelphia merchant purchased it and converted it into a general store. Local residents were extremely hesitant to enter the building, and it took many years for the community to fully accept its new purpose. The basement was permanently sealed shut, and no one showed any interest in exploring the cave system Dr. Harrison had described. Perhaps the most tragic consequence was that the fear and pervasive suspicion resulting from the Hartwell affair fundamentally and permanently changed the character of Milbrook. The trust and openness that had defined the community for generations were replaced by deep weariness and doubt. Neighbors began viewing one another with suspicion. Death became a source of terror rather than acceptance, and the simple faith that had united the community was irrevocably broken. Dr. Harrison continued his profession as a traveling physician, but he was forever altered by his experience in Milbrook. He developed an almost obsessive attention to detail during his mandatory inspections, scrutinizing every death with the thoroughness of a criminal investigator rather than a routine health official. His professional colleagues began to regard him as eccentric, even paranoid. Yet Dr. Harrison knew from brutal experience that profound evil could successfully conceal itself behind the most respectable facades. In 1847, nearly 24 years after his harrowing experience in Milbrook, Dr. Harrison received a letter that would fully vindicate his long-held beliefs and provide a final, chilling conclusion to the Hartwell saga. The correspondence arrived from a sheriff in the Oregon Territory, where the push of westward expansion had carried thousands of pioneers seeking new lives on the far reaches of the American frontier. According to the sheriff's narrative, a family calling themselves Caldwell had operated a funeral parlor in a small Oregon settlement for 3 years before being exposed under circumstances remarkably similar to those Dr. Harrison had discovered in Pennsylvania. The sheriff had read Dr. Harrison's old reports stored in federal files and immediately recognized the identical patterns: suspicious deaths, systematic poisoning, and hidden burial sites. When authorities finally raided the Caldwell establishment, they uncovered evidence of at least 30 murders committed during their 3 years in Oregon. More significantly, they discovered documentation proving that the Caldwells were, in fact, the Hartwell family, who had been migrating westward across America for over 2 decades, adopting new identities and continuing their murderous practices in every new community. The family was captured alive, and during their subsequent interrogation, they confessed to crimes spanning nearly 30 years and covering 8 different states. Their calculated victim count exceeded 120 individuals, establishing them as among the most prolific serial killers in early American history. Ezekiel Hartwell, now using the alias Ezekiel Caldwell, was 73 years old, yet he remained mentally sharp and displayed absolutely no remorse for his crimes. Martha, Josiah, Caleb, and Rebecca had all maintained their roles in the family's gruesome operation, constantly refining their techniques and expanding their methodologies with each new relocation. The family's confessions revealed the full magnitude of their crimes and finally provided closure for dozens of previously unsolved disappearances across the frontier. They described in chilling detail how they had perfected their sophisticated system of selecting victims, establishing credibility in new towns, and meticulously disposing of the evidence. Most horrifyingly, they expressed pride in their accomplishments, viewing themselves as successful entrepreneurs who had simply chosen an unusual line of business. Ezekiel Hartwell was executed by hanging in Salem, Oregon, in December 1847, followed by his wife Martha and son Josiah. Caleb was sentenced to life imprisonment, where he died of pneumonia in 1852. Rebecca, who was still relatively young and claimed to have been coerced by her family, received a 20-year sentence but died in prison from unknown causes in Townspeople in 1851. The revelation of the Hartwell family's true scope of crime sent shockwaves through the many communities across America where they had operated. Families who had trusted them during their most vulnerable moments realized they had been in the presence of calculating murderers. The case became a permanent cautionary tale about the profound dangers of placing blind trust in strangers, regardless of how respectable they might seem. Dr. Harrison, now in his 70s, traveled all the way to Oregon to personally witness Ezekiel Hartwell's execution and finally confront the man who had haunted his thoughts and life for over 2 decades. The two men spoke briefly just before the execution, and Hartwell expressed surprise that Dr. Harrison had actually survived his discovery in Milbrook, claiming that several other investigators over the years had not been so fortunate. In their final conversation, Hartwell revealed one last disturbing detail. The family had trained other individuals in their methods, apprentices who had gone on to establish their own similar operations in various parts of the expanding nation. He claimed that at least 3 other families were continuing similar practices, but he steadfastly refused to provide any details that might help authorities locate them. This final ominous revelation ensured that Dr. Harrison's remaining years would be spent with the knowledge that the evil he had first discovered in Milbrook was still actively spreading across America. The Milbrook community never truly recovered from the revelation that their trusted neighbors had been systematic murderers. The town gradually declined as horrified families moved away, unable to bear the heavy weight of their shared history. By 1860, Milbrook had been entirely abandoned, and the surrounding forest began to reclaim the buildings where so much horror had been concealed. Today, few official records remain of the Hartwell family's devastating crimes. The formal reports were buried deep in government archives, the sensational newspaper accounts were forgotten, and the communities they terrorized desperately tried to erase all memory of their presence. But for those who study the darker chapters of American history, the Hartwell case serves as a powerful reminder that evil can flourish anywhere, concealed behind masks of respectability and actively protected by the very trust and innocence it seeks to destroy. The story of the Hartwell funeral parlor demonstrates how serial killers could operate with complete impunity in an era before modern communication and coordinated law enforcement. It shows how predators could cruelly exploit the natural human trust that bonded communities together, using that very trust as a deadly weapon against their victims. Most importantly, it reveals how ordinary people, doctors, neighbors, even family members, sometimes hold the power to expose great evils, but only if they are willing to look past superficial appearances and courageously act on their deepest suspicions. Dr. Harrison devoted his remaining years to meticulously documenting everything he had uncovered regarding the Hartwell case, hoping that his extensive records might one day assist other investigators in recognizing similar patterns of crime. He passed away in 1853, carrying with him the intimate knowledge of one of America's most horrifying family criminal enterprises. His detailed personal notes were later discovered among his papers and eventually found their way into federal archives, where they remain today as enduring testimony to crimes that shocked even the professional investigators who eventually uncovered them. The dark legacy of the Hartwell family reaches far beyond their direct victims to encompass the fundamental societal changes they inflicted upon every community they inhabited. They utterly destroyed the intrinsic sense of security that had allowed small towns to operate as extended families, ruthlessly replacing deep-seated trust with widespread suspicion and innocence with profound weariness. In this sense, their damaging impact on American society extended far beyond the individual people they murdered, touching the very fabric of community life in the expanding nation. This chilling mystery powerfully illustrates how easily evil can masquerade as respectability, and how the very institutions we rely on for comfort during our darkest hours can sometimes shelter our worst nightmares.